thing that happens is Snow White starts to run through the forest, right? The husband's like, go, get out, get away. And so he's heading back to the castle while Snow White is lost in a forest. And in a forest in a fairy tale represents transformation. So when you're going into a forest and running through the forest, you're in a time of transformation. The story beats of Snow White. So one of the things that if you want to retell the story, and we want to like equip you guys to tell this story. And if you're, talking to, your younger sister, or you are like having a conversation with your daughter, one of the things that you want to do is get really good at telling them the story of Snow White fairly quickly. That's kind of what I want to train you guys to do. Same with Jack and the Beanstalk. We did this with boys. You really need to get good at telling the story of Snow White to girls. So I'll go over this really quickly. So the story beats of Snow White are, it begins when a beautiful young woman is born. So everyone's sort of stunned by her beauty. That's the first thing we learn about her. The next thing that happens is her mother is extraordinarily envious of her beauty, which is a very weird story. And the Grimms, when they heard this story from the people that were telling it in Germany, it was always a mother. But in the Disney version, was it her mother that was envious? Who was it? A stepmother, okay? Now that does come from a revision about 30 years later that the Grimm's brothers changed the story to a stepmother because it was so shocking and so weird to think about the mother being this envious. So we'll talk about the tension there between the stepmother and the mother. So she's being very envied by her mother or her stepmother. The father is sort of nowhere to be seen in this story. The mother looks into a mirror, and this mirror does something very bizarre. It ranks all of women by their beauty. So this is a very important part of the story. And of course, when she says mirror, mirror on the wall, what did she wanted the mirror to tell her she was the most beautiful. And what does the mirror tell her instead? Snow White's even more beautiful. And what does she do? She decides she wants to kill Snow White and eat her organs. Okay, I know this is weird. Sorry, this is the way it goes. She wants to eat her lungs and her liver. Lungs kind of represent, her life. The liver represents the place where the soul is. And so it's not, don't think about this literally. This is a symbolic depiction. So if you think about it too literally, you'll get grossed out. So don't get grossed out. She sends her huntsman to do this terrible deed to Snow White, and the huntsman has pity on Snow White and decides not to kill her and releases her into the forest, where she gets lost in that forest of transformation, comes upon a cottage full of dwarves. These 7 dwarves agree to allow her to stay in the cottage. They will protect and provide for her as long as she does some chores around the house. And she gets bored of doing chores and does what every woman who gets bored of doing chores does, and that is she wants to go on a shopping spree. And a nice peddler woman comes and 3 times offers her some amazing products. The first is some laces for a corset. The second is a comb. These combs are not actually for combing your hair. They're to like decorate your hair. And the final thing is an apple. Now in the Disney version, you only get the apple. We don't have the corset, laces, or the comb. Then this poisoned apple, because we find out that this nice peddler lady was actually the evil queen in disguise. She eats the poison apple. She goes into some crazy coma-like state where she's basically dead. She gets encased in a glass coffin by the dwarves until a prince rescues her, and they live happily ever after in the Disney version. But in the Grimm's version, that's not how it ends. The queen finds out about this other up-and-coming queen that has more beauty. She decides to go to this queen's wedding ceremony, and who does she discover is this new up-and-coming queen who's more beautiful than she is? It's Snow White. And so the penalty for matricide, which is being killed by your own mother, is to be placed into having some iron shoes. You dance to your death, and that's how the story ends in the Grimm's Brothers version. So you guys ready to figure out the meaning of all this? What do we do with this story? Okay, so let's start with the first beat of the story. Snow White is born, and she is so beautiful, and she's incredibly dreamy and very naive. And what that means is she's not conscious of her beauty. She doesn't know what's about to happen because she's sort of like a child at the early stages, and she's not aware that her beauty is going to stir up all this hatred towards her. She's just dreaming someday of maybe getting married, meeting a prince. She has no idea what is about to happen. She doesn't know that she's won the greatest genetic lottery in the world, which is she's a woman born with the greatest beauty. And you might think, oh, that's really cool. It'd be great to be the most beautiful woman in the world. But it's not great necessarily. There's a huge cost because not only do men notice that you're beautiful, who else notices you're beautiful? Other women. So this is one of the things that often is hidden about the cost of female beauty is they don't realize that they're going to have a problem with somebody, and that is they're going to have a big problem with Wonder Woman or Gal Gadot. She is incredibly envious of Snow White. So part of what we want to understand here is why wouldn't she be excited that her daughter is beautiful? Like, what would make her upset about that? She sees herself in a competition that she needs to win. We have a name for this kind of problem today. It's called like narcissism, where you care only about yourself. You don't really care about others. And so one of the things that the story is trying to tell young ladies is that one of the most hidden risks you will face in your life when you're trying to mature and find your husband is very selfish women, older women, who feel that they're in a competition with you. Now, a loving mother is not going to do this, right? But there are women who do this, and they oftentimes are very subtle. You don't see this coming. Now, one of the things that's interesting I find is, you guys know in the 10 Commandments, anybody know what the 10th commandment is, the last one? Most of the commandments are about things that are very concrete. Do not steal, do not lie, things like that. But the 10th commandment is what? Yes, you shall not covet. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or anything that belongs to your neighbor. This is a very weird commandment, right? Because all the other commandments are mostly like things you do. This is like something that's happening in your own heart and your own mind. Do not desire things that really belong to somebody else. Because the reason why I think this is in the 10 Commandments is that there's a brilliance to the reality that coveting or envying, which are very much the same thing, this is like a hidden disease that happens inside of a family or inside of a community or inside of a city or inside of a school or wherever you're around. It's very difficult to know if somebody is struggling with envy and kind of letting it take root in their own heart. Now, when you get older, one of the problems in this story is Snow White's very naive. She doesn't know about this. She doesn't understand how coveting works. She doesn't know how envy works. But as you get older, you start to notice the incredibly subtle signs that what you're dealing with is somebody else's envy. And this is a very difficult thing to figure out. Has anybody come up with a way of detecting this very difficult thing to detect? One for me is people that struggle with envy, they get sad when you're doing well and they get happy when you're doing bad. Does that make sense? Like they're rooting, like you think they're your friend, but when they see you succeed at something, you sort of can tell that it bums them out. And when they see you struggling, you kind of can tell that they're getting happy. That's kind of weird, right? You'd hope that your friend's rooting for you, but that's evidence that they might be struggling with this very subtle problem that often is just difficult to see. And the problem is somebody struggling with this, they could do things behind the scenes to try to pull you down because of that envy. So this is a really hard thing to deal with. And this is why we need a fairy tale to help sensitize us to the fact that this exists. And it's not good for Snow to be so naive. She needs to be aware that this is a problem that she might be dealing with. Part of what we're going to dive into here too is there could even be, and this is something that Jordan Peterson pointed out about Snow White, it appears that there could be a strategy for older women who are struggling to actually sabotage younger women's ability to find spouses. And this is a story that with the stepmother, I think it brings out that possibility a lot more. Okay, so that's the second beat of the story. What happens next? She's filled with envy. So what does she do? She goes to a mirror, and the magic mirror force ranks all women by beauty. So I know this is weird, but is there something that a woman could look into, some technology, let's say, where as she looks into it, she might be able to see lots of different women and figure out where she ranks in all of those potential, the beauty of other potential women. Oh, we have this device now, this magic mirror. All women have access to it. Isn't this wonderful? Okay, maybe not great. Okay, so a problem is, like, how does this work? If you're a young woman today, So we have this problem today, which is that young women have more anxiety now than we've ever seen in history. And as they've looked, this guy named Jonathan Haidt, he's a researcher. He basically says the moment this occurred was when Instagram became popular with young ladies and the like button was added to the algorithm. Oh my gosh, that's exactly what Snow White's describing, right? A mirror was given to young women and a button was put into the mirror to help them see, oh my gosh, my friend just got 20 likes on her selfie and I only got 5 likes. What happened? Why don't more people like my picture? Who wants to compete in this thing? Now, you can understand how difficult this is, okay? This is really, so if we took fairy tales seriously, we might notice this is not a great idea, right? It may not be good to introduce very young women to a competition where they're constantly figuring out where they rank. But this is what happened, and this is where the evil queen got so upset. This mirror was telling her, Snow White's more beautiful than you. Oh, so she's not happy with this. She is so enraged that she is losing this competition that she wants to devour Snow White. And this is, there's a verse in Galatians 5. Galatians 5 is a whole chapter in the Bible about part of the way that a Christian comes out of envy is you are filled with the Holy Spirit. And what Paul, who's writing this chapter, is saying is the way that you can tell if you are not filled with the Holy Spirit is he says, he's got these 2 verses, which I find really interesting. He says, if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. The opposite of having a community full of love is having a community full of envy, and envy leads to devouring each other, consuming each other. That's the symbolism. And so we can create a community of love and acceptance, filled with the Holy Spirit and the gospel, or we can end up in a community where we are biting, nipping, devouring, and attempting to consume each other. And Snow White is a story about how this happened to this family. Man, not pretty. And this is where we do have a problem, and that is that there are ideas being shared with young women today that are causing those young women, instead of utilizing their beauty to find a husband, they are often waiting until they're older and older and older as their beauty begins to diminish and then to find a husband later. Is that a good strategy? In general, that's not a good strategy. Young women have beauty. There's a place or a time in which they peak, and that beauty exists to help them get into a relationship with a man. And there's a strategy that older women have to try to cause younger women to delay that process so long that their actual ability to mate with a man becomes less and less likely. This strategy is getting worse. It's infecting more and more cultures. And I think that this is precisely what you would expect if you took this fairy tale seriously, that there's actually a strategy trying to cause young women to think this way. So she is trying to figure out how to get rid of Snow White. She's incredibly envious. She wants to devour her daughter or stepdaughter. But Snow is out in the woods. The huntsman takes her out there to kill her. And what ends up happening is the huntsman has pity on Snow White and decides not to kill her. Instead, he kills an animal and brings those organs back to the queen. And in most of these stories today, we talk about the heart. We don't talk about the liver and the lungs like they did in Germany because they represent something different in that medieval culture. In our culture, usually when you want to consume somebody's essence, we talk about their heart. And so that's why in our stories, oftentimes, that's how we think about what the huntsman is bringing back. So it's interesting. Often when we think about what is standing in the way of young women, like we think that they're going to be protected by their mother and that they are going to be in danger from strange masculine men. This story sort of turns that on its head. Who protects Snow White? It's this man who has no connection to her, right? That's a big part of the story. And who's threatening Snow White? It's her own stepmother, right? So that, again, part of what that doesn't mean that's normal. It just means that that's a hidden dynamic that women often won't understand. And that's why it needs to be explicitly shared with us in the form of a fairy tale. So the huntsman turns out to be a good guy, and he decides to not kill Snow White. Now, the next thing that happens is Snow White starts to run through the forest. right? The husband's like, go, get out, get away. And so he's heading back to the castle while Snow White is lost in a forest. And in a forest in a fairy tale represents transformation. So we're going to see this in multiple fairy tales as we hit other series of fairy tales. So when you're going into a forest and running through the forest, you're in a time of transformation. In the Disney version of Snow White, this was the part of the story they were actually most concerned about because it was so scary they thought it would freak children out. Like as she's running and screaming and encountering different things and trying to get through the forest. But I think it's a really important thing to unveil in the story. What this represents, the forest represents something Carl Jung points out that which we need the most will be found where we least want to look. That I think it's a really important quote or understanding that the last place that Snow White wanted to be was in the forest. But it's really in the forest that you discover the kinds of transformation where you can discover new things that you didn't know were there. And again, remember, Snow White's, her problem is that she's naive. She doesn't understand the way the world works. And the forest is there to sort of discipline her and grow her up and help her to mature and transform her from a girl into a woman. And that's really the transformation that Snow White's all about. How does a girl become a woman? And so she has to go through the forest of transformation. And as she's running around and becoming mature and becoming possible of finding her love, finding the person that she could marry, what does she then encounter when she's ready for love is a cottage full of what? Yeah, this is really important part of the story. Every woman virtually goes through this problem, which is when you think you're ready, you run into a bunch of dwarves. That's the story. And if part of what we're going to like uncover here is, so Snow White needs protection, right? Who should be protecting a young woman? Her father. Okay. Now, if you cannot find the protection of a father, that's ideal. The next person that most young women will turn to for protection is what? Usually like a boyfriend, right? Like she'll start to think about, she'll use her beauty to attract a man to protect her, right? That's what's normal. So those are usually the first two. You want to be protected by a father. That's the most important. But if you do not have a father to protect you, most women will find a romantic partner in a guy who will hopefully protect her, who'll become her husband, right? But there's a third option for protection, and that's what we find in this story, that there are these dwarves who, this is very confusing, and this is what we really have to unpack the meaning of why dwarves, like what is going on here symbolically in the story. And it is kind of weird how this whole thing happens, right? Snow White finds this cottage, she starts looking around, there's nobody there, she eats their food, then she runs upstairs and she finds their 7 beds and she decides to fall asleep in the beds. The dwarves come in, they're like, oh my gosh, somebody's been in our house, somebody's been eating our food. They start to like try to figure out who it is. They run upstairs, they look at the different beds. All of a sudden they find somebody asleep in the bed. They all get their axes out. They're about to kill whatever's in there. Snow White wakes up and they're all stunned by her beauty. And so they all run to the foot of the bed, and that's where this scene is. They're like, oh my gosh, wow. And so they become very shy because she's so beautiful. So that's the next stage in the story. And what's really weird in the story is all 7 dwarves basically fall in love with Snow White because she's so beautiful. And this is the next danger that you can run into as a young woman looking for somebody, is you could decide accidentally to fall in love with one of the 7 dwarves, which is not a good idea. And that's why symbolically they're dwarves. Now, can you guys name it's really important the way the dwarves, now they're not named this way in Grimm's fairy tales, but I think it's a really ingenious thing that the Disney version does. Do you guys remember the names of the dwarves? You got Dopey, you got Happy, you got Sleepy, yes, Bashful, Sneezy. So what is going on here? It's not just that they're short, it's not just that they're old, but it's that they're all they've got kind of only one dimension to their personality. They're not really the right people for Snow to settle down with. So this is a real challenge. This is something that I'm always telling my daughters, that make sure you don't fall in love with one of the 7 dwarfs, okay? Like, sometimes you'll run into a guy and you're like, he's really cool, he's got one dimension of his personality, but he's not ready, he's not really the right one for you. And so that's part of what Snow White begins to do, is she begins to almost train the dwarfs. She tells them they need to wash their hands. And the verse in the Bible that I always brought up and I've shared with my daughters is it says in the Bible, do not be unequally yoked, which means you need to find somebody who is a good match for you. And that's going to be difficult because as soon as you're ready to get married, you're going to be surrounded by dwarves, and they're going to have personalities and a level of maturity that may not be worthy of where you're at. And so you have to sift through that to find the right person who is ready. And that means you have to be equally yoked. Yeah, the thing about a yoke is that, yeah, you put them on oxen, and it's really important that when you do that, it's equal because you're stuck with the other person. So if they're working hard, you're working hard. If they're being lazy, you're being lazy. You're trapped and stuck and yoked together. And so Paul says in this passage, don't be unequally yoked to unbelievers, because if you're trapped or stuck together and that person decides, I want to go this way, and you're like, well, Jesus is calling me that way, you're going to, whoa. And this is why we say, be really careful who you marry, who you date, because you're going to be yoked with that person, and you're kind of stuck going in the same direction. You have to go with them and they have to go with you. And so you have to be extremely careful about who you're yoking with. Does that make sense? And so Snow White has to make the decision to not, no matter how much they're falling in love with her, you cannot become yoked to one of the seven dwarfs. That's not the right move. And so now what is the right move? How do you get protection and provision from the seven dwarves while not giving them really what they want, which is they're in love with you and they would love for you to be there forever? And what they actually come up with is an arrangement where Snow White will do chores while they're off in the mines working hard. And so why don't the dwarves just protect Snow White out of the goodness of their heart? Why is it important for Snow White to actually bring some value to the equation? Isn't she good enough? Isn't the fact that she's beautiful sufficient for her to be worthy of their provision and protection? Snow herself can become the evil queen if she believes that only through her beauty she can leverage her beauty endlessly without actually adding any other value. And there are women who are being trained by older women today to think this way about their relationships. You don't need to do anything of value. You just enjoy the fruits of your beauty. And exceptionally beautiful women today are pursuing this very self-centered and narcissistic idea that they don't need to add value in those relationships with men. They just need to endlessly tread on their beauty. Now, the problem with that, of course, and this is what the evil queen discovered, is that beauty doesn't last forever. The beauty exists for a season of your life to help you get into the right kind of relationship. And that's one of its primary purposes. And then it does fade. And that's why we have an amazing chapter in the Bible like Proverbs 31 that says, do all of these really valuable things in the relationship, be an equal partner, constantly try to create value, because beauty is fleeting, right? And it's vanity. It's not the end result. The end result is to get into a relationship, be equally yoked, and then to be moving in the same direction, not to endlessly tread on your beauty. But this story is unveiling that. And that's what is such an incredible tragedy about the new Disney movie, which essentially was saying the opposite. What was so terrible about the recent Disney Snow White, it was not that they misunderstood Snow White. It's that they tried to invert the message and actually make it the opposite, say the opposite thing that it was telling young women. Like, this incredibly ingenious story was trying to express to young women something that is so hidden and so important for them to know. And then instead of listening to that ancient wisdom, we said we're going to use that story and invert it so that women will be as lost as they possibly can be. And this is why I'm going to be very hard on that. You do not want to do that to a story. That's very dangerous. It's not just dangerous like bad storytelling. It's misleading the next generation, because these fairy tales, this is where we get hidden wisdom. So she's doing all the cleanup. She's making sure she's adding value, but she's getting bored. And what does a beautiful woman want to do when she's bored? Go shopping. Yes, of course. And so fortunately, what happens next is somebody comes to help her spend all of her hard-earned money. And we get then these three interactions that she has with the evil queen. So the evil queen decides to dress up like a peddler woman and comes to the cottage. You know, she discovers through the magic mirror that Snow is not dead, but is still alive and living with the dwarves. And so she gets out there and she gives Snow these three different, she exchanges or sells Snow these three different items. And so people have talked a lot about these three items. The laces for a corset. You guys know what a corset is? So it goes around your waist and you tie it really tight. And so she's trying to like choke off Snow White. Now, the thing about a corset, what it's designed to do is accentuate your beauty, right? So it's trying to make that, for good or for bad, the way that men generally think about this is that the ratio between waist and hip size, that's a huge deal in the visual way that men see women. And so that's a kind of a strange reality, but it's something that what the evil queen wants is she wants to make Snow White conscious of that. Remember, Snow White is not really conscious of this. She doesn't know exactly how men work, and she doesn't realize that. And so the queen is trying to wake her up and cause her to live in the same world that she lives in, a world of competition. And she knows that Snow White, there's something incredibly beautiful and endearing about Snow White's naivety. She wants to corrupt Snow White by causing her to become conscious of this competition she's in and the beauty. And she does that through the corset laces. Then the second thing she gives her is this comb. Comb is really like usually an heirloom in most families. So this is like a decorative item you'd put in your hair. And this is like one of the worst betrayals. People have looked at this, the symbolism of the comb, which is one of the deepest thing a mother does to nurture her daughter. And she's using this to try to destroy Snow White. And then of course you get the final picture that we get in the Disney film. There was only one, and that is the red apple. And when you think about a woman being tempted to eat a poison apple, what does that bring to mind? This is a retelling of the Garden of Eden, remember? So Eve was tempted to eat this fruit, and as soon as she ate it, bam. And so this image in the Disney film where Snow falls unconscious and then releases the apple, and you see that she's taking a bite. So this is the ultimate sort of symbol that's going on here, is that she, the evil queen, wants her to become fully conscious. And this is what happens in the story of the garden. You guys remember what happened to Eve when she ate from the apple? She like, boom, became aware. And remember God said that the minute you, like the day you eat of it, you will die. So this is like a retelling of that idea. And it's a very complicated idea that that when you become conscious and fully mature, your innocence is somehow gone and she became aware that she's naked. And so this happens to Snow White in this sort of symbol of eating from the tree or eating from the apple. It's poison, and the queen believes that she's won. And so she, instead of getting into innocence and maturity through marriage, she gets there through the apple. And this symbolically represents her, she's sort of been deceived into a fall. And so she literally falls. Then the dwarves come. In the Disney film, the dwarves actually, chase the evil queen off a cliff and put Snow White in a glass coffin. So this is a really interesting moment. Now in the Grimm's fairy tale, she's also in a coffin like this. And the whole point is to preserve her beauty. Like they see her, they see that she's like incredibly beautiful still, and they want to, they're so grieving what happened to her that they want to preserve her. And this preservation allows her beauty to be kept for just the right moment when the stalker shows up and decides to rescue her, right? Now, what's actually happening here? This is really in contrast to what happened with the apple, right? Her loss of innocence through eating the apple, what really she needed was to find a husband and to attract a husband. In the Grimm's fairy tale version, it's kind of weird the way they do this. So this prince comes upon this coffin and just falls like amazingly in love with the beauty of Snow White and decides to like cart her around because, I guess that's what you do when you're just astounded by something's beauty, And so while Snow White's being carted around, she hits a bump, and in one of these bumps, it dislodges a piece of the apple that's still in her throat, and poof, it comes out, and she comes conscious. And still kind of the love of the prince is what rescues her. But in the Disney version, it's true love's kiss. And one of the really complex parts of Snow White that we're really grappling with here is the role of beauty in the phase of life that a woman's in when she's looking for a mate. And Snow White makes a very, very, very big deal of the importance of beauty. And this is hard on us today because it's like, why should beauty play such an incredible role? Beauty is what protected her and caused the dwarves to provide for her. Beauty is what attracts this young man and causes the young man to choose to kiss her and bring her out of this coma. Beauty is also what got her in big trouble with the queen. And so it's important to understand that basically Snow White is a story trying to help us understand the complexity of beauty in the life of a young woman. And when you're talking to a young woman about Snow White or your daughter or your sister, whoever, part of what you're doing as women, telling the story to other women, is you're grappling with the complexity of beauty in the life of a young woman. And so this is one of the things that we have to be realistic about. Snow White's beauty was both what brought her down and what protected her, and then ultimately what redeems her in the end. Ancient stories were trying really, really, really hard to deal with the complexity, and it is hard. Like, this is a harsh reality, you guys. It's hard to grapple with the role of beauty in this phase of a young woman's life. But what you don't want to do is basically tell her you don't need a man and beauty will not have any impact on you. That's what women want to hear sometimes. That's the sort of current ideas that are being told to women, but it's not actually true. And that's what's hard. So yeah, I think that's part of why I think this story that was being told by Disney is essentially attempting to deceive women from what's actually, and I think that inevitably, or the actual theme of the 2025 version of Snow White was basically following the ideology of the evil queen. All right, the last part of the story, of course, is in the Grimm's fairy tale. We have this really weird, there's not a lot of pictures of it, but I found this nice little cartoon. The punishment should fit the crime and be a deterrent. And so basically, there was a actual tradition that the penalty for matricide, and that is being killed by your own mother, which did happen sometimes. Sometimes mothers would poison their children for weird reasons like this, was to be locked into these hot iron shoes. So